Alireza Firouzja takes on the Jobava London System. How will he do? This game was inspired by the game from Hikaru Nakamura that I saw yesterday, that I presented. And while I was studying it, I realized the position had only been reached one time before, and it was a game of Firouzja where he had the black pieces. So I'd like to take a look at that and see how Alireza Firouzja handles the Jobava London System. He has the black pieces. His opponent is named Denis Makhnev, who's rated over 2,400, a strong player. This was played at the Asia Nations Cup in 2018. Let's jump right in. d4 was played by Firouzja's opponent. Knight f6, bishop f4, g6, and knight to c3, the Jobava London System. d5, and here his opponent plays the move knight to f3. Jobava purists usually prefer to play e3 here, but knight to f3 is a perfectly good move. It's been played at least twice by Magnus Carlsen, and leads to very interesting positions. c6, just like the game we saw with Nakamura, Firouzja plays a Schlechter-Slav structure, a Fianchetto plus a c6d5 Slav structure. e3, bishop to g7, and h4, obviously, we've seen this idea as well, threatening to open up the h-file, give that rook force down that kingside lane, and queen to b6, a thematic move, hitting the b2 pawn. And here white plays a3. We have also seen this. This is an indirect way to defend the b2 pawn, because if queen takes b2, then knight to a4. And the queen has absolutely nowhere to go and is completely trapped. So the move a3 defends b2 indirectly. And bishop to g4. This was played by Firouzja. And this is where our games diverge. In Nakamura's game, he played bishop to e2. Definitely the best option here. But here, Denis Makhnev plays the move bishop to d3. And if you look at it, naturally you're thinking, well, if I put the bishop on d3, that's a more aggressive post than e2. But it actually isn't. Because when black plays this g6 pawn, it kind of blunts the diagonal here, makes it harder. I mean, if white can open that up, okay, but that's not so easy. Also, it keeps the pin on this knight on f3, and with the bishop on e2, not only does it relieve the pin, but it can later support perhaps a g4 advance once the knight moves. So usually in these Jobava London structures against a Fianchetto, the bishop usually belongs on e2, an important thing to remember if you play the Jobava London yourself. Knight b to d7 and queen to d2, clearing the way for a queenside castling, but allowing Firouzja to grab the knight on f3, and he retakes with the pawn, the only way he can retake. Now, here we get some imbalances in the position. White obviously does have a weakened structure, doubled pawns, an isolated h-pawn. Two bishops compensate for that to some degree. The issue is, can he make anything out of his open lines on the king side, or will black be able to exploit the weakened pawn structure? That's the battle that we're faced with. And here in this position, Firouzja makes maybe his best move of the game. It seems pretty natural, but it's a really great move. It's the move knight to h5. Now, what makes this such a great move is that it does a lot of things all at once. I've always believed that the best move in a game of chess is a move that advances your plans and stops your opponent's plans at the same time. And knight h5 does that. It blocks this h-pawn, keeping it from advancing. It hits the bishop on f4. White can't let him take that bishop and get isolated tripled pawns, give up the bishop pair. He has to move the bishop, so it gains a tempo. But finally, it prepares the move e5, the natural pawn break in the position by unblocking the bishop at g7. So it's a move that does a lot of things, a very strong move from Firouzja. So the bishop moves, it has to, and he immediately breaks in the center with e5. And black does have a satisfactory position here. It looks like white's best move is to just go ahead and castle long, but instead he takes on e5, then knight e5. And black is really starting to get pressure. You can see Firouzja aims at the d3 bishop to get rid of white's bishop pair, but he also threatens knight to f3 check, which would win the queen. That would be a disaster. And he also threatens the pawn on b2. That trap of the queen isn't there anymore. If he, say, plays bishop to e2 to defend f3, then black can play queen takes b2, and now there's no trap. Obviously, knight to a4, and he would just lose his rook with check. So he can't do that, really forcing white to take the knight on e5 with his bishop. But this is a big concession, but the knight was too powerful. Now, Firouzja recaptures, and over the course of the rest of this game, I want you to look at this dark squared bishop and see how powerful it is. I mean, it really dominates the proceedings and makes White's life very difficult. Then now he long castles, and Firouzja castles short, not worried or that worried about White's open lines. F4, advancing on the king side with tempo, bishop G7, and F5. So, I mean, White has some threats, right? He wants to play rook DG1, open up lines against Black's king, see if he can generate something. So Firouzja needs to distract White from his kingside attack. And we all know this, that the best way to deal with an attack on the flank is to counterattack through the center, through the middle of the board. And that's what Firouzja does here with D4, opening up lines in the center. Pawn takes, now queen takes, and you see there's this queen-bishop battery aiming at B2. I mean, you can't get at it now, but the pressure is building. King goes to B1, rook A to D8, creating a pin along the D file. Rook D to E1, now rook F to E8 to challenge that rook. Rooks are exchanged. Rook to E1. White wants to get those rooks off the board, but that's really not the best plan. Rook E1, queen E1, and now bishop to F6. With this move, Firouzja is exposing the weaknesses that White has created. These open lines of attack have now turned into pawn weaknesses, and he's attacking the H-pawn and also creating a little place for his king to hide on G7 after a back rank check. FG6, HG6, queen to E8 check, king to G7. So now White goes after the queenside pawns, queen to C8, attacking B7. Firouzja ignores that and goes ahead and plays knight to F4, threatening to take twice on D3, the final capture being with check. White does allow that. Queen takes B7, knight takes D3, CD3, and queen takes D3 check, king to A2, and queen to C4 check. And in this position, I mean, a lot of games of chess are decided by who has the better minor piece. Here it is not even close. This bishop at F6 completely dominates the knight on C3. I mean, it is pretty much a decisive factor. I mean, it is that big of a deal. If the king runs from the check, then queen to F1 check, king A2, and now he can give up that bishop at the opportune time, BC3 and queen F2 check, and this would be a winning position for Black because he just has double attacks all over the board. Firouzja's king is safe, White's king is exposed, and he can keep checking and position his queen in an ideal position over and over again. So this position is completely lost for White. So instead, he blocks queen to B3. Instead of taking the queens, he goes ahead and takes the pawn on H4. Now he has a little bit of material. He's up a pawn, has the better minor piece and the safer king. F3, the idea is that White wants to play the knight to E4, try to give that knight an anchor in the middle of the board to make it a little more competitive with the bishop. So what Firouzja does is he plays queen to D4. The idea here is if White does play knight E4, then Firouzja can play queen to D5, getting queens off the board, basically, and transposing to an easily won endgame with his extra healthy kingside pawn. So White simply can't allow that. It's a transposition to an easy winning endgame. So he plays king to A1, but then queen to E3. Firouzja is attacking the F3 pawn, pinning the knight to the queen. And in this position, there are too many dominating factors for Black, and White resigned. A possible continuation if White played queen to B7, trying to attack Black's queenside pawns, would be to give up the bishop, pawn takes, and queen takes C3 check. And obviously, the house is falling for White. So this is a good example of how to handle the Jobava London with Black. And the real lesson for those of us who play the White side is don't be afraid to put that bishop on E2 if Black firing kiddos. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.